was a rainy day, the kind of day that seemed to mirror the emotions of those who hurried through the city. The large drops of rain fell heavily, as if the sky were crying along with the souls who hid their anguish under umbrellas and hoods. The avenue, usually noisy with the constant movement, was now silenced by the incessant rain, muffling the sound of hurried footsteps and distant horns. People passed each other like shadows, immersed in their own routines, without noticing what or who was around them. In the midst of this flow of indifference, a solitary figure stood out, although no one seemed to notice her. An elderly woman walked slowly along the wet sidewalk, each step heavy, as if she carried the weight of decades on her fragile shoulders. The raindrops not only ran down her face, but seemed to merge with the marks of time that traced her wrinkled cheeks. Her clothes were simple, worn by time and use. An old brown coat with carefully hand-sewn patches wrapped her body awkwardly, but with the dignity of someone who strives to maintain a respectable appearance, even when the world around her seems to turn its back on her. Her shoes, perhaps once elegant, were now shadows of the past. Old-fashioned boots, made of worn leather, whose soles threatened to come apart at any moment. On her head, a large floral scarf, already colorless, covered her white hair, which escaped in wet strands, molding itself to her face. In her aged hands, marked by life, she held a crumpled piece of paper, which she stared at insistently, as if it were her only compass in that sea of indifference. Her eyes, despite being tired, remained steady, scanning the facades of the buildings, searching for something. "It seems to be here. The number. It's the same as on the letter," she murmured to herself, almost silently, as if she needed to reaffirm each step she took. Finally, the old woman stopped. The relief was almost visible in her hunched posture. Before her, imposing and opulent, stood an elegant restaurant. The golden light escaping through the large glass windows illuminated the wet streets, and for a moment it seemed as if Miranda were on the edge of another world, a world that did not belong to her. The people who entered and left the restaurant moved with the confidence of those who knew that this was where they belonged. Men in well-cut suits and women in silk dresses walked past her without even sparing a glance. To them, she was invisible, an irrelevant detail in the scene. "You only have time to ask for money," said a tall man, as he adjusted the collar of his shirt, without looking directly at her. His words cut through the air like a cold blade, but left no visible mark on the old woman. She did not react. It was as if she had learned over the years to shield her heart against casual cruelty. But Miranda was not there for charity, nor to beg. She had a mission. That night represented something much greater for her. The paper she held, already slightly wrinkled from the rain, was a reservation. Yes, a carefully made reservation, planned for weeks. She had saved every penny of her small pension to pay for that night. It was not for luxury or for her own pleasure, but for something infinitely more important. She held a hope in her heart, a hope that she had never let die, even on the darkest nights, when loneliness was her only company. Miranda took a deep breath. Her trembling hands pulled at the heavy glass door, and for a moment she hesitated. Her eyes stared at the reflection in the glass, the reflection of an aging woman, almost unrecognizable to herself. But soon that moment passed and she entered. Inside the restaurant, the contrast was stark. The lights, hanging from crystal chandeliers, bathed the room in a soft, cozy light. The walls were decorated with contemporary works of art, and the smell of fine food hung in the air, mixed with the expensive perfume of the customers. The furniture, made of dark wood and upholstered in refined fabric, conveyed a sense of absolute luxury. Miranda took it all in for a moment in wonder, like someone entering a forbidden place. But it wasn't a look of desire. It was the look of someone who, for a brief moment, felt transported to a world she might have known in her youth, but that now seemed so distant. She walked forward, moving with discreet dignity to the receptionist's desk. A young woman with a practiced smile served the customers in front of her with kindness and courtesy. But as soon as Miranda stopped in front of her, the smile disappeared. The young woman gave her a quick, cold look up and down, as if she were assessing every detail of her appearance: the old clothes, the worn boots, the faded scarf. The expression on her face changed to a mixture of disdain and impatience. "You must be in the wrong place," she said, not even hiding her tone of contempt. "This restaurant is not the kind of place for people like you." For a moment, Miranda felt the ground disappear from under her feet. Those harsh words, which echoed with cruel clarity in her ears, reminded her of all the years she had been treated as someone on the fringes, invisible to the world. But she did not let herself be discouraged. There was something much more important at stake. She raised the piece of paper in her hands and answered, her voice firm but trembling. "I have reserved a place. Everything is paid for." The receptionist, disconcerted by the old woman's determination, hesitated. She looked at the paper, then at Miranda, and reluctantly began to check the reservation. With each passing second, the young woman's discomfort grew. After all, how could someone like that woman be allowed to be there? Deep down, she already knew something was wrong. But when the confirmation of the reservation appeared on the screen, her surprise was even greater. "Indeed, your reservation is here," the young woman said, incredulous, but without losing her tone of contempt. And so began Miranda's night, a night in which she would face not only the cruel looks and comments of those around her, but also the ghosts of her past and perhaps the chance to find again what life had taken from her. As soon as Miranda crossed the door of the restaurant, she felt a current of warm air enveloping her tired body. She looked around, her eyes still adjusting to the brightness of the luxurious lights, the stark contrast with the wet darkness outside. For a brief moment, silence took over her thoughts. The grandeur of the place seemed to suffocate her. The impeccably set tables with cutlery shining in the soft light were surrounded by people who chatted animatedly, laughed and toasted, as if there was no room for worries there. It was a distant world, almost surreal for Miranda. She took a few hesitant steps towards the counter, where the receptionist, who was still looking at her with disdain, was holding the phone with an air of barely concealed irritation. The uncomfortable silence between them was broken by the young woman's voice, who wrinkled her nose as she spoke. "Did you really reserve a table here?" The doubt in her tone was cutting, as if the very idea of a woman like Miranda having made a reservation at that place was absurd. Miranda, without losing her composure, nodded and handed over the paper with the reservation again, already slightly damp from the rain. The receptionist looked at the paper reluctantly, and with a quick gesture picked up the phone to call the security guard. "Richard, come here now," she said in a sharp tone. Within seconds, a tall, burly man, dressed in an impeccable uniform, appeared beside her. "Do we have a problem?" he asked, staring at the old woman with an expression of curiosity mixed with skepticism. Miranda, realizing the situation, took a deep breath. She knew that her worn appearance was being judged at that moment, as it had always been in other places where she was seen only as an old and poor woman. But that would not make her back down. She had saved for months to be here, and she would not allow her effort to be wasted. "I already told you I have a reservation," she repeated firmly, trying to keep her voice even. The security guard looked her up and down, as if assessing whether she might cause some kind of trouble, but his expression seemed more intrigued than hostile. "Show me your reservation," he asked, in a tone less rude than the receptionist's. Miranda, with trembling hands, handed him the paper. Richard checked the data, and after a brief moment of waiting, he finally confirmed. "Yes, there is a paid reservation. It's in the system." The receptionist, annoyed, frowned. "That can't be right," she muttered. "This restaurant is frequented by high-class people. She doesn't fit in here." Miranda's eyes filled with pain at that, but she said nothing. It wasn't the first time someone had belittled her because of her appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But something inside her was beginning to break. Each word of contempt was like a knife cutting through her dignity. She stood her ground, but inside she felt smaller and smaller. The receptionist, irritated, turned to the security guard again. "I don't know what's going on, but she can't stay here." It'll ruin the atmosphere. Look at her." Miranda, listening to every word, fought to keep the tears at bay. Her heart was beating faster, and memories of a life full of hardship and rejection came flooding back. She knew this was a crucial moment, not only because of what was to come, but because this reservation meant so much more than just a meal. It was her last chance to see her son, Scott, the owner of the restaurant, whom she hadn't seen in decades, but until now no one knew that. As the tension grew, one of the customers, a middle-aged man in a dark suit and an expensive watch, noticed the commotion near the counter. With a disdainful expression, he stood up and walked over to where Miranda was being evaluated. "What's going on here?" he asked in an authoritative tone, clearly irritated by the interruption of his meal. Upon seeing the elderly woman, he didn't hesitate to give his opinion. "Why is this woman here? This isn't a charity shelter. She clearly doesn't belong here." Miranda felt her stomach churn. The man's words weighed as much as the receptionist's, but they came with an even colder cruelty. The humiliation she faced at that moment seemed endless. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. The world around her began to seem more hostile by the second. "What are you waiting for? Call the real security or throw her out yourself," the man added with an impatient gesture. Other customers began to notice the situation, and the whispers gradually grew louder. The muffled laughter and disdainful glances turned to Miranda, who until that moment had tried to maintain her dignity. But it was difficult to remain standing in the face of such cruelty. Richard, the bouncer, looked uncomfortable. It was not his style to be aggressive with an elderly lady, but the circumstances put him in a difficult position. He looked at Miranda and said in a softer tone, "Ma'am, I understand that you have a reservation, but this may not be the right place for you. These customers are not used to these types of situations." Miranda, with tears in her eyes, looked at him, and for the first time that night, her voice trembled. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I need to talk to someone." She didn't elaborate. The stakes were too high to be explained in a few words, but the truth was that she didn't want to be treated like an intruder in a place where her only wish was to be reunited with the son she had lost so long ago. The receptionist, still impatient, shook her head and said in a sharp tone, "I already told you. She can't stay here. She doesn't belong here." Miranda knew that, to these people, she was nothing more than a nuisance. Her old clothes and frail body didn't belong in their world. But she had survived so much: poverty, abandonment, loneliness, and it wouldn't be that public humiliation that would make her give up. Even though the weight of rejection was almost unbearable, Miranda remained standing, her eyes fixed on the horizon, like someone who knows that, beyond the humiliation, there is something greater to be achieved. The cruel words around her became distant noises, and the only thing that occupied her mind was the hope that, somehow, she would be able to see the sun she hadn't seen in so long. That hope, that small but persistent flame, was what kept Miranda going, even when the world around her seemed intent on tearing her down. Miranda continued her walk through the room, feeling every heavy gaze on her shoulder. Her skin burned under the silent, cruel judgment of those around her. She walked slowly, her legs shaking from the effort of climbing the stairs and the accumulated tension, but her purpose kept her going. The room was filled with sparkling lights, crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like distant stars. The ambiance was opulent, designed to highlight the luxury and success of those who frequented it. But for Miranda, it was a barrier. Every detail seemed there to remind her that she did not belong here. She finally stopped in the center of the room, where all the tables seemed to converge. Around her, the conversations died down, and curiosity mixed with contempt in the looks that were given her. Suddenly, a booming laugh cut through the growing silence. A man in a dark suit, sitting at a table with a few friends, looked directly at Miranda and, with a cynical smile, said, "What is this? Has this turned into a homeless shelter? Who let this woman in?" His words echoed through the room, followed by muffled laughter from the other diners. Miranda closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears. Each insult felt like a sharp knife, cutting her from the inside. The world around her was full of people who would never understand her pain, her losses, her past. They saw only a shell, an old, ragged woman who seemed to have no place here. But there was so much more to Miranda than they could ever imagine. She was about to take another step toward the back of the room, where she knew the owner of the restaurant usually sat, when a hurried waiter approached, looking at her with obvious concern. "Ma'am, please, I need you to walk me out," he said in a nervous whisper. "We don't want to cause trouble here." Miranda, however, shook her head stubbornly. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she replied, her voice wavering but full of determination. "I need to see the owner of this place." The waiter hesitated, his eyes drifting to the customers who continued to watch the scene with growing interest. "The director won't want to see you, ma'am. It's not a good idea." He tried again to guide her towards the door, but Miranda stood firm. "I need to speak to Scott," she said, finally mentioning the name she had kept close to her heart. The waiter frowned in confusion, but before he could answer, a new voice came from behind them. "Scott? Why do you want to speak to the owner?" It was the receptionist who had come down the stairs, now accompanied by 2 security guards. "He's not available to people like you," she continued, not hiding the contempt in her tone. Before she could respond, Miranda heard the voice she would never forget, even after so many years. "What's going on here?" The deep, controlled voice belonged to Scott, the restaurant owner. He had just entered the room, drawn in by the commotion. His eyes quickly scanned the room until they found Miranda's hunched figure at the center of all the commotion. For a brief moment, Scott's eyes met Miranda's, but he didn't recognize her. The man in front of her was different from the boy she had known. The boy she had raised, whom she had loved with all her heart, had grown into a successful, strong man, with features hardened by years and responsibilities. He looked at her like a stranger. "Why is this woman here?" he asked the receptionist, his tone impatient. "This is not how we treat our customers." Miranda felt her heart tighten in her chest. He really didn't recognize her. All that effort, all the time she had spent saving, waiting, had culminated in this moment. And now the very son she had so longed to see again saw her as an intruder. "Mr. Scott," the receptionist began, "this lady claims to want to speak with you, but clearly, she doesn't belong here." Scott frowned, clearly confused, but his expression was cold. He stared at Miranda for a moment longer, as if trying to understand what had brought her here. "Why do you want to speak with me?" he asked directly, his voice sounding impersonal, distant. Miranda summoned all the courage she had. "Scott," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "Don't you remember me? I'm your mother." The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing, attentive to the unfolding scene. Scott, for a moment, seemed paralyzed. Her words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't process them. "My mother?" he repeated in disbelief. "That's not possible. My mother died many years ago." Tears began to stream down Miranda's face. "I didn't die, Scott. I never wanted to leave you. I was forced to leave you, but I always waited for the day I could see you again." Scott took a step back, as if he needed space to breathe. His gaze was fixed on her, and something inside him began to shift. He vaguely remembered a woman, a mother he had lost when he was very young. But this couldn't be real. You're really my mother?" Scott asked, his voice wavering for the first time that night. Miranda nodded slowly, tears still rolling down her cheeks. "Yes, it's me. I came here today because I needed to see you, because I never stopped loving you." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and thick, as Scott tried to process it all. The room, now completely silent, awaited his answer. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Scott and Miranda, as if time had stopped completely. Scott, still stunned, could hardly believe what he was hearing. The woman in front of him, ragged and aging, claimed to be his mother, a woman he had spent most of his life believing was dead. His thoughts were jumbled. He, who had always been so controlled and self-assured, felt his world suddenly crumble in front of all his customers and employees. Scott stepped back, trying to process the flood of emotions that were overwhelming him. All his life, he had believed that his mother had abandoned him, leaving him to be raised in an orphanage with no explanation. That belief had shaped who he had become, a rigid, hard man who had learned to protect himself from pain by creating barriers between himself and the world. But now, here before his eyes was the woman who claimed to be his mother, alive, breaking down every defense he had built up over the years. Miranda, for her part, was equally stunned, though in a different way. The emotion of finally seeing her son again after so many years of separation and silence was overwhelming. She knew that this would not be an easy reunion, that the past had separated them in deep and painful ways. But even so, the love she felt for Scott, the same love that had sustained her through all the years of loneliness and uncertainty, was still alive, strong and pulsing. She was willing to fight for him, to redeem herself for all the mistakes and decisions she had made in the past. Scott, my son, I know that all of this is hard to believe. I know it seems impossible, but please hear me out, Miranda said, her voice choked with emotion. I never wanted to abandon you. Never. It was the most painful thing I've ever done in my life. But I was sick, very sick, and I had no choice. I believed that leaving you at the orphanage would be temporary, just until I got better. But things didn't turn out the way I expected. When I came back to get you, you had already been adopted, and believe me, I tried everything to find you, but I couldn't. Scott shook his head slowly, still in disbelief. His mind was in conflict. Part of him wanted to believe Miranda's words, but another part, the part that had learned to protect itself from pain, told him that it was absurd, that it couldn't be true. The pain of abandonment was still an open wound inside him, an emotional scar that had never truly healed. Why now? Scott finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Why, after all these years, do you show up here? Where were you all this time? I grew up believing that you were dead, that you never wanted to have me, that you left me forever. Miranda took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. She knew this was a crucial moment, that her next words could determine the future of her relationship with her son. I know I hurt you, Scott, and you have every right to feel that way. I was an absent mother, and that's something I'll carry with me forever. But I never stopped loving you, not even for a second. All these years I looked for you. I had nothing, but I looked for you any way I could, and now finally I've found you. Miranda's sincerity pierced Scott's heart like an arrow. He wanted to stay strong, resilient. He wanted to remain the cold, impenetrable man he had become. But there was something in her words, something in the pain in her voice that made him waver. He remembered his childhood, the emptiness he had felt when he lost his mother, but he also remembered small moments of affection, how she would hold him and sing to him before he fell asleep. Those memories, so long repressed, were now coming back to him with overwhelming force. Scott began to speak, but his voice faltered. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to hug her, accept her forgiveness, and fill the void he had carried for so many years. But another part of him still clung to the anger, the pain of being abandoned, the sense of betrayal that had shaped his life. Scott, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Miranda said, her voice soft but firm. I just want you to know that I'm here now, that I've never stopped loving you, and that if you give me the chance, we can start over. I can't change the past, but maybe we can build a future, even after all this time. The room was silent, as if the world had stopped to observe that moment. The customers, previously so oblivious to Miranda's reality, now looked at the scene with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. Richard, the security guard who had initially stopped her, watched the scene with teary eyes. He, who had witnessed the cruelty of the world so many times, now felt a lump in his throat as he watched the difficult and painful reunion between mother and son. Scott, feeling the weight of the decision that lay before him, looked at Miranda one last time, his eyes filled with conflict. He knew that forgiveness would not be easy. He knew that the scars of the past did not disappear overnight. But in that moment, something inside him, something he had not even known still existed, compelled him to take a step forward. With a heavy heart but determined, he took a step toward Miranda. His hands shook slightly as he reached out to her. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive completely," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. We can't change what happened, but maybe we can start over." The tears Miranda had been holding back finally rolled down her face, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope. With eyes full of emotion, she took a step towards her son, and after so many years, she finally hugged him. A shy hug at first, but it quickly became strong and full of love. The hug they had both needed for so long. In the hall, the silence was broken by soft whispers. The unexpected reunion between mother and son brought tears to the eyes of some of the spectators, who had previously looked at Miranda with disdain, but now saw in her a strong, courageous woman, and above all, a mother who, despite her mistakes, had never stopped loving. The hug between mother and son, although brief, carried the weight of decades of silence, hurt, and separation. As Scott released Miranda from his arms, he pulled back a little, still with a mix of confusion and emotion in his eyes. He didn't know how to process everything that was happening. Her words still echoed in his mind. "I never stopped loving you." As much as he tried to remain cool, there was something undeniable in Miranda's sincerity, something that awakened feelings that had been buried for a long time. Miranda, on the other hand, felt relieved, as if that hug had been the first step towards the redemption she had sought so much. Her shoulders, always weighed down by the weight of guilt and loneliness, felt lighter, even though the journey was far from over. She knew that Scott's complete forgiveness would not come immediately, but that moment of connection was a sign of hope, and that was what she needed to keep going. "Scott, my son, I know it won't be easy," Miranda began, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to forget the past. I've made mistakes, and you have a right to be hurt. But I'm here now, and all I want is a chance to show you that I've always loved you, a chance to explain what happened, and maybe someday a chance to redeem myself in your eyes." Scott was still processing the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling. He remembered the years he had spent wondering why his mother had left him, wondering what he had done wrong. The pain of abandonment had shadowed him throughout his life, shaping who he had become. But now, faced with the truth Miranda was revealing to him, he felt something new, a desire to understand, to finally have answers to the questions that had haunted him since childhood. I want to understand, Mom," he said hesitantly. The word mom came to his lips instinctively, but he didn't correct her. "Why did you leave me? What really happened? I need to hear your story." Miranda took a deep breath. She knew that this moment had come, the moment when she would have to revisit the painful memories of her life, open up the wounds she had tried so hard to heal over the years. But at the same time, she knew that this was the only way to redeem herself, to be honest, to be transparent, and to show Scott that, despite everything, she had never forgotten him. "When you were just a baby, I was alone in the world," she began, her voice low, as if she were telling a long-kept secret. "I lost your father before you were even born. He died in an accident, and I was completely helpless. Your grandparents didn't support me, and your aunt and uncle had their own families to take care of. I did what I could to take care of you. But soon after, I started having health problems. My heart, it was weak. I had several fainting spells, and the doctor said I needed urgent surgery." Scott listened silently, absorbing every word. He remembered his childhood vaguely, but the missing pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. "I didn't want to leave you," Miranda continued, tears in her eyes. "But I had no choice. The surgery was risky, and I had no one to take care of you. That's when I decided to leave you at the orphanage temporarily. I thought it would only be for a few weeks until I got better. But things didn't go as I expected. The surgery was more complicated than expected, and I spent months in the hospital. When I finally came back, ready to pick you up, you had already been adopted. She paused, the weight of the memories pressing against her chest. I looked for you, Scott. I tried to find you in every way I could, but the adoption laws were strict. I had no access to information about your new family. It was like you had disappeared from my life. Scott's heart sank now. He had grown up believing he had been abandoned, but hearing the truth, the details he had never known, changed everything. It was painful, yes, but it also brought new understanding. His mother had not abandoned him by choice. Circumstances had forced her to do so. Miranda wiped away the tears that were streaming down her wrinkled face. I know I can't change the past, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. But I have waited for this moment for so long. I have wanted to see you, to tell you the truth and to ask for your forgiveness. I don't expect you to forgive me completely right now, but I just hope you'll give me a chance to be a part of your life again, somehow. Scott was silent for a few moments, struggling with the conflicting emotions inside him. He'd spent so long harboring anger and pain that he didn't know how to process what he was feeling at that moment. But there was something different now, a thread of compassion, an understanding that was beginning to dawn. He realized that just like him, Miranda had suffered too. She'd faced years of regret and loneliness, and it touched something deep inside him. I don't know how to move on from all this, Scott finally admitted, his voice low. But I guess we can try. We can start slowly. Miranda looked at him with eyes full of gratitude and hope. That's all I ask, my son, she said, with a weak but sincere smile. That's more than I could hope for. It was a beginning, a small but significant beginning. Miranda felt that for the first time in many years there was a real chance for redemption, a chance to rebuild what time had broken, to heal the wounds they carried, and perhaps find a new beginning. Scott, for his part, knew that the road would be long, but he also felt that something inside him had changed. He was willing to give a chance to the woman who, after all, had never stopped being his mother. That brief understanding between Scott and Miranda, even with all the wounds still exposed, represented a new stage in their lives. Despite the pain, confusion, and the weight of years of separation, one thing was beginning to emerge in that reunion: the power of the love that united them. Miranda had always believed that the love she felt for Scott would be the thread that would guide her back to him, no matter how many obstacles life had thrown in the way. And now, in front of her son, she saw a small opening, a chance to rebuild the bridge that had been destroyed by time and circumstances. Scott, for his part, was immersed in a roller coaster of emotions. The encounter with his mother had shaken all the convictions he had carried for so long. What had seemed clear before, the anger, the pain of being abandoned, now mixed with a new feeling. He still felt a part of himself in conflict, but something inside him recognized that his mother's love had somehow survived the passage of time. It was this love that was now beginning to break down the barriers he had built around himself. The two of them were silent for a few moments, a necessary pause to absorb everything that had been said. The environment around them, which had previously seemed suffocating with the judgment and whispers of others, began to dissolve, as if only the two of them existed in that moment. Miranda watched Scott carefully, trying to decipher his thoughts, and he, in turn, began to understand something he had never admitted to himself. The love he felt for his mother was still there, buried beneath layers of resentment and hurt, but still present. I know you're still hurting, Miranda said, breaking the silence with a soft, tender voice. I feel it in you, and I understand. But what I wanted you to know most of all is that my love for you never changed, even when we were apart for so long. That love was what kept me alive, what gave me the strength to keep searching for you. Scott looked at her, his heart aching at her words. There was a truth there that he couldn't deny. Even though his mother had made mistakes, even though he had been left behind, her love had remained intact through the years apart. He could see it now, in her eyes, in the trembling voice that expressed both regret and hope. "You've always been the most important thing to me, Scott," Miranda continued, her eyes brimming with tears. "Even when life took me away from you, I never stopped thinking about you, about how you were, about where you were. It was this love that kept me alive. I know that time has stolen a lot from us, but what it couldn't steal was this, what I feel for you." Miranda's words hit Scott hard. He still felt the pangs of pain from being abandoned, but at the same time he was beginning to realize that his mother's love was real, palpable. He knew deep down that love has a strength capable of overcoming even the most difficult circumstances. Scott, no matter how much he tried to shut himself off, couldn't ignore this truth that was beginning to unfold before him. "I know things won't change overnight," Scott said, his voice calmer, though still charged with emotion. "But I want to try. I want to try to understand and see where this can lead us. Maybe we can rebuild something." Miranda nodded, excited. Her hands were shaking slightly, but now it was with joy and relief. She knew that this moment was just the beginning of a long journey. There were still hurts to heal, pains to face, but the fact that Scott was willing to try was all she could ask for. "I didn't expect anything more, Scott. I just wanted to see you, to hold you one more time," Miranda said with a fragile but sincere smile. "But knowing that you're willing to give me a chance, that's more than I could ever dream of." Scott looked at his mother, and for the first time, saw beyond the wrinkles, beyond the worn clothes and the difficult past. He saw the woman who, despite everything, had never given up on loving him. The love she showed, even in her flaws, was something unshakable, and he knew that deep down, that was what mattered most. Her love had survived, as had his, no matter how twisted it was. As they both tried to process the emotions that were emerging, Scott felt a sense of relief begin to fill his chest. The weight of so many years of hurt was beginning to dissipate, albeit slowly. He knew that the path to complete forgiveness would still be long, but he also knew that the love that united them had the power to guide them along that path. Little by little, the room around them began to move again. The people who had previously watched the scene with curiosity now seemed less interested, returning to their conversations and meals. For Scott and Miranda, the world around them no longer mattered so much. What really mattered was what was happening there, in that small space of time and emotions. They had taken the first step towards rebuilding the bond that had been broken, and that step had been taken based on what had always been present, even in the darkest moments: the power of love. Scott took a deep breath, feeling a calm begin to settle in his heart. He looked at Miranda with a mixture of tenderness and resolution. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said, his voice softer now. "But, Mom, I'm willing to try." Miranda's smile widened, and the tears that fell were now tears of happiness. She knew that she had finally found her way back to her son's heart. Love, after all, had prevailed. The shy hug that Scott and Miranda had shared had been the first step towards a possible reconciliation, but that gesture did not erase the long road that they both had to travel. Still, in that small exchange of affection, there was something deeper that was beginning to reveal itself: the undeniable importance of family. While the weight of emotion still hung over them, Scott began to reflect on everything that had happened. He realized that as much as he tried to distance himself from his past, the absence of his mother had shaped who he had become. Life without Miranda had not been easy. Growing up in an orphanage far from the warmth of a family had left deep scars on Scott. He had learned not to wait for anyone, to build his independence and to be strong on his own. He had believed that financial and professional success would be enough to fill the void he felt. But now, in front of her mother, she realized that none of that could replace the love that had been taken from her, No achievement, status, or prestige could heal the wound of being separated from her own family. Miranda, for her part, had always known the importance of family, especially after she had lost contact with her son. Her life, after the separation, had been a constant void, filled only by the hope of being reunited. The loneliness she had faced, life on the streets, the lack of family ties. All of this made her understand in a painful way that family was the most precious thing one could have. And now, in front of Scott, she felt that she finally had the chance to rebuild those ties. Even though time had separated them, the fact that they were here, together, represented an opportunity to start over. "Scott," Miranda said, her voice low but full of emotion, "I know you've been through a lot without me, and I know nothing I say will change that. But what I want you to understand most is that family is the most important thing we have. I know I wasn't the mother you needed, but I want to be a part of your life now if you'll let me." Scott was silent for a moment, thinking about his mother's words. He knew there was some truth to them. Throughout his life, he had tried to fill the void of family absence with material achievements, but none of it was enough. And now, looking at Miranda, he realized that, as difficult as it was, her presence brought him something he had always wanted, even if unconsciously, the feeling of belonging, of having a family. "I spent most of my life trying to forget what happened," Scott began, his voice shaking a little. "But no matter how hard I tried, it was always there with me. The fact that you weren't there, that I didn't have a family, that was something I always carried with me. And somehow, it shaped everything I did." He paused, taking a deep breath as he tried to gather his thoughts. "I became this strong, independent person because I felt like I had no other choice, but deep down, I think I always wanted something more. Something that money or success could never give me." Miranda nodded, understanding every word her son was saying. She knew he was talking about the need for a family, the desire to feel connected to something bigger, to someone who truly cared. The lack of a mother figure, of a home, had left Scott adrift, even if he'd never admitted it out loud. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through, Scott," Miranda said, tears in her eyes. "If I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. But the only thing I can offer you now is what I've always wanted. A mother who loves you, who wants to be by your side, no matter what." Scott looked at her, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. That moment, as painful and confusing as it was, represented something he had always longed for. The return of his family, the reunion with his roots. He knew there was still a lot to be resolved, many conversations to be had, but deep down, he felt that he was no longer alone. Miranda was there, willing to start over, and that in itself was already a giant step. "I think maybe I spent too much time trying to convince myself that I didn't need anyone," Scott said with a half smile, still filled with sadness. "But now, seeing you here, I realize that maybe I was wrong. Maybe, deep down, I've needed you all along." Miranda felt a wave of emotion course through her. Those words coming from Scott were more than she could have imagined. The simple acknowledgement that he needed her was confirmation that the bond of family, despite everything, was still there, could still be restored. "I've always been here," she said softly. "I've always waited for this moment. And no matter how much time passes, you will always be my son. Always." Scott looked at her, and for the first time in many years, felt a calmness take over his heart. Miranda's presence did not erase the scars of the past, but it brought a sense of comfort, of belonging. The idea of having his mother back in his life, of finally being able to reconnect with the only family he had, was at once frightening and reassuring. Maybe time did not heal all wounds, but family love, a mother's love, could be the beginning of a new phase. Their reunion was not only about forgiveness and reconciliation, it was about recognizing the importance of having someone to share your life with, someone who, despite all the mistakes and pain, was willing to start over. Family, after all, was what remained when all else failed. And in that moment, Scott finally began to understand how essential that was. Miranda smiled, a smile of hope. She knew that, from now on, the road would be difficult, that the years of separation would not disappear in the blink of an eye. But she had something she hadn't had before, a new chance to be a part of her son's life, and that, to her, meant everything. Part 8. The message of the video. Scott and Miranda's reunion had been marked by a roller coaster of emotions, but now, with the truth exposed and the first steps taken towards forgiveness, something essential began to emerge. The message about the power of love and the ability to rebuild family ties even when everything seems lost. Their story was not just about the past, but about the importance of the present and what it can offer. An opportunity to start over. As Miranda watched Scott, now with a less closed expression and more open to the idea of having her in his life again, she felt that despite all the lost time, they were finally on the right path. It didn't matter how painful the past was or the scars they both carried. What mattered was the love that still existed, the foundation they needed to rebuild their relationship. "What matters is that we're here now," Miranda said with a soft smile. "We can't change what happened, but together we can do our best from here on out." Scott looked at her, and for the first time he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of so many unresolved issues seemed to finally lift. And what was left was the understanding that no matter how painful life had been, there was room for redemption. Miranda's love, unconditional and patient, had stood the test of time. Now he was willing to let that love guide him on a new path. "I think it's time to stop running away from what really matters," Scott said, his tone softer. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to try. I want to try to be the son you've always wanted. And maybe, in time, you can be the mother I've always needed." Scott's words resonated deeply with Miranda. The journey would not be easy, and they both knew it. But the fact that they were willing to try was a miracle in itself. Family, after all, was the bond that connected them, and the love they still had for each other was proof that not even time or circumstance could erase that connection. The room around them, which had once been the scene of judgment and contemptuous glances, now seemed far away. What mattered was here, in this moment between mother and son, where love and forgiveness began to blossom. The scars of the past were still there, but the healing power that love offered was greater than any wound. At the end of the conversation, Scott and Miranda left the restaurant side by side, without needing to say much more. The simple fact that they were together, that they shared the same space again, was proof that they were ready to move on. For Miranda, every step by Scott's side was a victory, a reminder that hope should never be lost. And for Scott, every moment with his mother was a chance to give new meaning to his life, to rewrite his story with her presence. The message that this story brings to all of us is clear and powerful. Love and forgiveness have a power capable of overcoming the greatest adversities. When we allow love to guide our actions, even in the most painful situations, we find the ability to heal, to transform, and to reconnect with what really matters: family. No matter how distant we become, nor how deep the wounds, love, when genuine, can reopen doors that seemed closed forever. Miranda and Scott's reunion reminds us that it is never too late for reconciliation. No matter how many mistakes have been made, how much time has passed, or how far apart we are from our loved ones, there is always a chance to start over. Sometimes all it takes is a courageous step in the right direction, a gesture of humility and openness to forgiveness. And when we take that step, we can discover that love is much stronger than any hurt. We would like to thank everyone who followed this moving journey of reunion, forgiveness, and love. Miranda and Scott's story shows us that the power to heal is within us, and that family, despite all its complexities, is an essential part of who we are. We hope this story has touched your heart and brought you reflections on the importance of never giving up on those we love, even in the face of adversity. Remember, there is always time to start over. Love, when true, is a force capable of healing the deepest wounds and uniting those who, for one reason or another, have been separated by time or life. May today's story inspire everyone to give love and forgiveness a second chance in their lives. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this message of hope. May you take this learning into your own life, cultivating love, reconciliation, and the importance of family. Until next time,